Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Happy Saturday, August 5th, 2023. My name is Bob Abbey, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian for the City of Forest Grove, and I'm really pleased you can join us today on whichever platform you're using, whether it's YouTube or Facebook, for this program entitled Improving Your Soil by Composting with Worms. We're very fortunate to have Kris LaMar, who is a Metro Master Recycler and OSU Master Gardener with us, and I'll bring Kris on in just a moment. As always with these programs, we encourage you to share your questions or comments in the chat box for whichever platform you're using, whether it's Facebook or YouTube. And if you have questions or comments, go ahead and post those when you can, and we'll get to those at the end. And another reminder that these programs reside on the library's YouTube channel. So if you happen to tune in today and you need to leave for whatever reason, or if you want to let other folks know about this program, they can watch on our YouTube channel forever. You can also watch on Facebook, but it's a little harder to find videos on Facebook. So YouTube is usually the best first choice, but those will be there. Once we finish the broadcast, they'll go right to YouTube. So please let your friends and other folks know about these. So I'm going to bring Kris in, and oops, let me unmute you. Hi, Kris. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. I'm excited to talk about worms and poop.
You know, you don't usually hear that sentence on a Saturday afternoon, but
I know. And the kids that I've taught this to, the grade schoolers, that's the only time they can use that word, and they get so excited because at home that's not allowed.
Well, worms and poop, I think, are a good way to get us started. And I'm going to oops, hang on here one second. So we're going to be doing this a little differently today. I am going to be running the slides from the background, and Kris is going to let me know when I need to move ahead. So Kris, I'm going to back out of the stream right now, and I'll come back in when you're done and we can chat. And also, if we get some questions from folks, we can go through those. So we'll see you in a few minutes.
Okay, thank you.
So you are good to go.
Okay. So Bob, are you going to do one slide at a time?
Yes. So once you tell me to move, I'll move the slide first. So right now we're on your title slides.
Okay. And that's all we're seeing right now? Because
yes.
I can see all of it.
Yeah.
All of the PowerPoint. Okay. Yeah. So, well, thank you so much for taking the time to learn a bit about what is going on out there in the wonderful world of decomposition. As my title indicates, I'm both a master recycler and a master gardener. I took my master gardener training first, and while I was waiting to start volunteering, I saw that there was a class upcoming in Clackamas County to become a master recycler. And both of those courses had composting as a part of them. The master gardener one, because you can improve soils using compost, rot, and the recycler, because really composting, decomposition is Mother Nature's oldest form of recycling. And as perhaps some of you know, when you get your organic material picked up by your garbage collector, it goes off and you can buy compost back. But why give your valuable possessions from your garden that you're no longer using away when you can keep them at home? And particularly, you can utilize some workers who you don't have to get Social Security numbers for, you don't have to have withholding taxes, and they will provide you with valuable fertilizer, valuable nutrients. And that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Next slide, please. So here's kind of an overview of what we're going to cover today. And first of all is just worms. We take them for granted. We know there are lots of them. I suspect a lot of people don't know the difference between worms and snakes, but we don't like them often just because they're strange and kind of creepy, kind of like spiders. Secondly, to talk about soil and what is soil and what is healthy soil, and how we can utilize these worms and other mechanisms to change our soil health. And finally, the whole compost and composting process, to some extent, backyard composting, which I'll refer to in just a second, but to reuse and to use worms. And worms will tell you a lot about whether you have a healthy environment, and they'll help to improve it. And again, you don't even have to pay them any wages. Next, please. So worms come in a variety of sizes and shapes, and they have different roles in our environment. The top left are nematodes, also called roundworms. And one small gram, just what you would hold in your hand, of soil, there are hundreds of them in there. You won't see them because they're all microscopic. And when I say soil, in the entire context of this presentation, I'm talking about Mother Earth. I'm not talking about topsoil that you bring in from some commercial establishment. I'm not talking about potting soil. I'm just talking about that good old clay soil that we find every place here in the Willamette Valley, and a lot of people curse it, but it is the home of many, many types of live animals and bacteria and fungi, and nematodes fall into that category of valuable microorganisms. These vary in size. They range in size from 0.3 millimeters long, which obviously you'd need a microscope to see, but some of them go up to 26 feet long. Now, we don't have any of those here in the Willamette Valley, but around the world, they exist in large measure and in large sizes. Some roundworms are actually can be ingested, and they can make animals very sick. So you want to avoid some of them, but those aren't what the worms that we're going to talk about today. The more common are the earthworms, and per square meter, so almost a yard, you'll find anywhere between 30 and 300. And one of the tests of whether you have a healthy soil environment is whether you have a good supply of earthworms. And most of us know that earthworms are somewhere between 3 and 6 or 7 inches long if you get the larger varieties. And most of the ones that you see, you'll either find when you're digging, or they didn't make it home after the prom in the morning, and it got too warm and dry out there for them, and they died on the sidewalk or the street. Another type of worm that we are not going to be covering today, but not to be confused with the type of worms who do the composting that's so valuable, are the invasive Asian jumping worms. And they go from 1.5 to 8 inches long. You'll find them in primarily forest environments. One of the reasons that they have become quite a pest here in the Pacific Northwest is that they're such good composters that they managed to reduce all of the decomposing, rotting material on the forest floors to deprive other animals, primarily worms, at least the ones that live in the top 6 to 8 inches of the soil, for reasons we'll explore in just a second. If you find a worm, a large worm that is jumping, please report it to the Oregon State Forestry Division or the Department of Agriculture, because we don't want them to remove all the opportunities for enriching native soils, particularly those, as I said, in our forest areas. Next slide, please. But these are the worms we're going to be covering today, the ones that you can employ in various places in your environment. They're called Eisenia fetida, or red wrigglers, and that's a typo there. It's not wiggler, it's wriggler. They're the best for composting. The earthworms that we just saw pictures of can go down fairly deeply into the soil. Now, the soil has to be of a type that they can push their way through there. Uh, a worm is essentially two different tubes. One on the inside is an intestinal tract, and then on the outside are muscles of various sizes. And in order for a worm to survive in the environment, they have to be able to stay at the right temperature and with the right moisture. Now, some of you might recognize the word fetid, bad smelling, and that doesn't mean that the worms themselves or even their castings, their poop, smell badly, but it's the fluid that they secrete when they sense that there's a predator about to eat them. It makes birds are their primary predator, but the birds can detect that and they are afraid of being poisoned or it just doesn't taste good, so they leave them alone. And we can't detect it, but if you handle red wrigglers, you're probably going to have your hands covered with, or at least touch some of that fluid. It won't hurt you. It's not known to be noxious. Their diet consists primarily of bacteria, fungi, and the nematodes, the smaller worms. You have to remember that they don't have very big mouths. Each worm is a hermaphrodite, so they're in the middle of their body. They have the sexual organs of both sexes. And if you see them curled around each other, they are copulating. Please give them a bit of privacy. And each of them ends up inseminating the other and being pregnant. And under the right conditions, they can live a long time producing many eggs throughout their lifetimes. You'll often see the eggs. Where I see them the most in my composting are between the two flat pieces of paper in cardboard, and they also love to lay their eggs in eggshells. But they need temperatures between 40 and 70. They don't have an air conditioning system and they don't have parkas. So it's important when you think about using red wrigglers that you not put them in the sun where the temperatures these days are getting up into the 90s and the hundreds plus. And of course, the closer you get to freezing, the more you're going to run the potential of losing them just because they can't tolerate that. And so if you're going to think about an environment for them and you don't want to bring them indoors, and I'll cover that in a little more depth in just a minute, putting them in the shade on the north side or the east side where they're not getting hot sun during the day is the best place to put them. They breathe through their skin. They don't have lungs the same way that many other animals do. So you have to keep their skin moist. So they need to be in that kind of environment. So keeping them covered is an important part of keeping them healthy and alive. They're blind. They're what is called photophobic. And once they feel light, they actually experience pain, and they will use their outside muscular system to escape from it as quickly as possible. They don't know where they're going, but they can detect heat and moisture through their skins. And because, like chickens, they don't have teeth, they have tiny little gizzards in them to break the already small pieces of food down that they swallow. And the gizzards are next to their stomach and it has to have some kind of grit in it. Actually, clay or coffee grounds will serve that purpose. And it's a grinding process so that it reduces the size of the solids. And then it just goes into their intestines just like the rest of us. Next slide, please. So let's talk about soils. Loam is the perfect soil. If we had loam throughout the world, we could grow any crop that we wanted. Most of our landscape and vegetable plants would be healthy. And I suppose we wouldn't have anything to gripe about in terms of the heavy clay soil that we have here in the valley. But the perfect soil actually has this very common explanation of what's in it. It's 25% water. And think of the creatures, including worms, that live in the top 6 to 8 inches of our native soil. They need water. The worms need it for some purposes. Other animals need it in terms of hydration, etc. They also have to have air because they are animals and they're breathing. One of the ways that you can make sure that your otherwise perfect soil becomes almost unworkable is to walk on it. If you've ever purchased a house that's new and they've added a landscape after the building was complete, but the building required all kinds of heavy vehicles to push the soil down, it compacted it, and both the water and the air were pushed out. And it's very difficult to get that returned to condition that soil microbes and the many animals that live in the topsoil are able to penetrate. And of course, if you have plant roots down 5 to some tomatoes go down a foot, the roots go down a foot or two, you have to have air holes, pores, and full of air. There are micro ones that you can't see, and then there are macro, large ones, and it's that the water can get down through those pores and keep the plant roots moist. They all require some degree of plant moisture so that they don't dry out, and then the plant dies. But as a larger percentage, 45% of perfect soil are some combination of minerals. Now, if it were really, really perfect, 15% or a third of the mineral would be our wonderful clay, 15% would be sand, and 15% would be silt. Now, if you look at sand under a microscope, and I urge you to find a picture of it, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's pastels. It's made up largely of quartz. Some of the pieces look like little seahorses. And the thing about the mineral content of sand is that it doesn't have a magnetic charge, quartz, for example. And so at the beach, when you watch the tide come in and then go back out, you'll see that the water goes right down through the sand because it doesn't hold the water. And in the process, any nutrients that might be in that water are washed away as well because it doesn't hold them magnetically. Silt is a strange combination of whatever happened to wash down from the mountain. You find silt along riverbeds, and whatever came off the land through erosion or bad farming techniques, whatever came off the hills and mountains because of mining or just natural erosion of that hard rock tissue or hard rock ends up being a part of silt. And under a microscope, silt is actually larger than clay, but typically smaller than sand. And it looks like concrete, little bits of concrete. Clay, on the other hand, is, depending upon whatever the base rock was, to various degrees, it has a magnetism. And in shape, if you look at it under a microscope, again, it looks like lasagna. And between those sheets of lasagna, the magnetism of the clay helps to hold the nutrients that are going through the plant. Sorry, my phone's off, but it's still telling me I'm having an emergency. So I'm not. So we hate clay. If you look at a map of the world, though, the areas of the world that are primarily a clay soil are where most of our agricultural products come from. We're mostly fed by areas such as the Midwest. Used to be Ukraine was the breadbasket of Eastern Europe. Up in Washington, you'll find a lot of clay soils. And clay is manageable, but only if you create artificially or naturally these water and airways so that the parts of the plant, the roots that need to absorb the water and nutrients, will be able to be kept moist. Now we're down to organic material, which is 5%. And organic material kind of has different meanings, but in general, it means it came from an organism. It's something that either is alive or was alive, and it's now rotting, decomposing. So it can include the microbes that we were talking about, bacteria, fungi, nematodes, but it can include some spiders, the worms, essentially anything that is alive or has been alive that breaks down, that's in general come to be because of the growth of plants, either being eaten by animals or the plants themselves that are decomposing. And decomposition just means that you're taking large, sophisticated structures and somehow breaking them down so that they can be reused. Let's go on to the next slide. So soil organic material is the fraction of the soil, this 5%, that consists of plant or animal tissue in various stages of breakdown, decomposition. The optimum percentage you saw in the previous pie chart is 5%, but it can go as low as 3% and still be considered healthy soil. But within the last 4 years, one of the grad students at Oregon State University tested raised beds in Oregon, the metropolitan area. They were all gardens that were managed by master gardeners, and found that 13% was the average amount of organic material. So somewhere between 2 and 5 times as much as there should be in that. Now, you'd think, well, isn't more better? Well, no, because too much composted matter in your soil can produce phosphorus runoff. Phosphorus runoff then goes into our water resources, whether it's rivers or streams, eventually, obviously, into the ocean, and to some extent into the water that's right under the bedrock that we all walk on all the time. So when you think about organic material, you need to think about how much you're using and what the content is of the organic material that you're adding. And they've found that these master gardeners who ostensibly knew what they were doing in their raised bed gardens, they were putting in so much organic material that occasionally the roots of their plants would burn because there was too much nitrogen. And nitrogen is the nutrient that plants need the most of for photosynthesis, etc. But too much of a good thing is not a good thing. Next, please. So here's one form of home composting. And if you ever have a barbecue out on the patio or the deck, you can actually say that you are doing home composting. It may not show up in a black bomb that you throw your kitchen scraps and your extra paper in, but exactly the same process is going on. Human composting, unlike worms, but it's the same basic mechanism, requires over 1,000 different species of bacteria, and all of those live in your gut. They're absolutely essential to your being able to absorb the nutrients that are contained either in the plant material that you're eating, or if you eat animals, but the animals that you eat all ate plants or other animals. And most of these bacteria live in the colon. A few live in the mouth, some in the stomach. Important ones live in the stomach that break down as you have eaten and saliva has gotten it to your stomach. You're going to have a variety of bacteria that some of you may have dealt with in a bad way if you have acid reflux. The acid's produced by a specific kind of bacteria that lives in your stomach. And you can see how many bacteria are found in 1 gram of intestinal content. Now, one of the things that bacteria do in the decomposition process is to give off gases. You've been in a crowd and somebody got embarrassed when one of those gases appeared, and acids. And people have problems with their colons often because there's something, some kind of a break in the colon, or it's gotten out of balance. So the next time you have a hamburger, just know that you are participating in a form of composting, decomposition, taking this elegant hamburger or rib and changing it back into its basic molecules and to some extent other atoms through the help of a lot of different bacteria. Next, please. So here's just kind of the basics of composting. Decomposition, the process of breaking down complex organic materials so the atoms and molecules can be reused for new growth. So every atom on this planet has been used and reused probably millions, even billions of times over and over, showing up again in a different plant or animal and being put into different molecular sizes and shapes and constructs, depending in large part upon their magnetic positive or negative traits. Animals are breaking these down through chewing and the acids, especially the ones in the stomach and the colon, and then the microbial forms of life in your intestinal tracts. Now, one thing that you don't want to get in your intestine is a fungus. Obviously, you get athlete's foot and athlete's crotch rot, I guess, through fungi and nail fungus, but you don't want that inside you. And frankly, a fungus couldn't live within that environment anyway, because fungi have to have air, and there's no air in that environment, but they can live on the skin. And of course, you wouldn't want the nematodes or roundworms. You wouldn't want the kind of composting worms we're talking about either, but they wouldn't like that environment anyway because they need air and water. So the microbes in backyard and worm composting, because they're live things, need air, liquid, and the right temperature and pH environments. pH means acidity. Most plants grow somewhere between 6.5 and 7. 7 is neutral, it's what water is. But microbes have to have very unique pH environments. Some of them can survive in alkaline, which is the opposite of acidic. And if bacteria, for example, grow in an environment without oxygen, which would include your gut and the guts of all of the animals that we're talking about, then they produce ammonia, which you've probably experienced if you've ever mown a yard, put the grass clippings in a pile, said you'll come back and sometime in the future, and within 3 or 4 days you come back and you can hardly get close to that pile because the anaerobic, the bacteria that are able to survive in that airless environment, are producing ammonia, a gas, and it smells terrible. So the way to cure that is to add air and water, and then they die, and the aerobic bacteria can keep decomposing organic material around them. And that's important to remember with worms and backyard composting in our black bombs, etc. Next slide, please. So here, there are some structures that you can either build or buy to create a worm bin to provide all of these elements that worms need to do their job, breaking down, decomposing just through their intestinal system so that you can utilize what their waste is to help your soil. The structure on the left is just 2 bins, storage bins, one nested in the other, and on top of a lid. Now there's space so that what's called worm tea, because you have to keep moisture in there and you have to have a way for that to drain because you don't want molds to start growing in it. So you want to collect the liquid down below. You can see in the middle structure, which I think is an Earth 360 one, and those are various tiers, and each one has worm castings, something like cardboard or paper to keep them from falling through to the bottom, and then of course the food that you put in. And they have a drain, and you can put some kind of container underneath it to collect the worm tea. the construction on the right is, we tend to think that these structures have to be pretty well organized. Like you have the kitchen in one section and the living room in another, and the bedroom and then the bathroom. But worms don't care about that. They just need those three ingredients that we talked about before: air, temperature, and moisture. The one on the right is interesting because the worms are going to be living in that brown area in the middle, again, because they don't like light, but there's enough air and assumedly water that their physical needs are met. And then there would be some, you can see there's a spigot on the right, and that there's a collection thing in the bottom. You can go really cheap, like the one on the left. The one on the left you can't see very well, but what this needs to have is the top bin has to have holes, small holes in the bottom of it, so that the worm tea goes through. It also has to have, and again, I can't see it in this picture, but it has to have some holes in the top, quite a few of them, so that you've got an airflow for the worms. And that, to some extent, should be in the bottom container as well. Unfortunately, they don't stay on the floor of the apartment building that you place them in, and especially the little ones, the babies, tend to fall through and end up in the lower apartment. Next slide, please. Now, there are some things that should not be added. This is true whether you're talking about one of those black bombs or a worm composting operation, for somewhat the same reasons. First, meats and bones. You don't want to put anything in your composting structure, whether it has worms or just outside, that's going to attract vermin. Rats, for example. Your neighbors will not be happy with those new neighbors. And these type of additives to composting systems also attract flies and other types of insects that you would not want anywhere close to your home or your garden, because some of those may transmit viruses. They're what are called the vectors for those viruses. So keeping away from that, and that's to some extent why you don't want to put dairy in, because dairy products curdle and they tend to attract insects that you don't want in your area. Oils and fats should, for somewhat the same reasons, not be put in. They tend to attract pests of the flying and walking type. They also decompose very slowly for the most part. Butter, for example, can take forever. That doesn't mean it won't start molding, but in terms of breaking it down so that you can add it as a soil amendment is something that you just don't want. And then, of course, animal feces. And I alluded to this earlier. One of the problems with using animal feces is that many animals actually carry the roundworms, the nematodes, in their intestinal systems, and they play havoc with our intestinal systems if they get into our body. I answer a lot of questions for Ask Extension, and just had one from a person who apparently had some raccoons who had defecated in their vegetable garden. And I had to do some research on account of that. And literally you have to remove the soil. That's the only way to ensure that you're not going to end up with these problems in your body. And the same thing happens with compost, particularly if you're going to add it back to your vegetable garden. So keeping animal feces, whether it's a domesticated animal like a cat or dog that you have, or a wild animal who finds your garden attractive, and the easiest way to do that is to put up some kind of preventative screens or fences, etc. Next, please. Now, here are some things, and kind of the test is, would you want this in with your garden? Would you want it in your soil, whether you're using it as a vegetable garden or a landscaped ornamental garden? Cardboard can be especially tricky, and you can see two of the things that you probably would not wish to have in your compost. One of them is the plastic tape. It'll probably decompose, but it might not be in your lifetime. Ditto the metal staples. But one of the unseen problems that you can have using cardboard, which is a great fiber, and as I said, it has places where the worms can lay their eggs, but you don't want to be putting metal in. But the thing that you can't see is that many of these cardboard boxes are often reinforced because they have heavy contents. They're reinforced with filaments of plastic. And the plastic, again, is not going to decompose in our lifetimes, particularly if it's buried, because plastic decomposes better if it's exposed to the sun and heat. So test, and you can test the cardboard to make sure that it doesn't have these filaments in it, just by letting it soak in water for a couple of days. And pretty soon you'll see that the fiber from the cardboard will peel away from those filaments. Frankly, it's easier just to avoid using that cardboard at all rather than trying to pull the filaments out. On the right hand, you'll see a great thing that you should be using in your compost, and that you can certainly put into worm bins, and that is the fiber contained in either junk mail or envelopes that get tossed summarily. But the problem is, you can see those plastic windows. Those are probably a plastic that's not going to decompose. So if you're going to use them, I suggest two things. First, if you're going to use the envelopes, pull out those plastic windows. Number one, they're waste. Second thing is to shred what remains of the junk mail or the envelope that it's in. And I'm going to show you in just a minute why that is important. But you might as well utilize these fibers. It took how many decades to grow a tree so that you could have a cardboard box or an envelope? And how long does it take for you to burn it, which puts the carbon back into the air? And why don't you just shred it so that it can be of use in your garden as an organic material, or again, to help the worms have an environment that they're comfortable and healthy in. Next slide, please. Now here's some of the problems, and I've already alluded to a couple of them. And you can find these problems in both the black bomb composting systems and worm composting. Molds occur. Mold is a type of fungus. The problem is that some molds, like black molds and the ones that get into our lungs, they can be hazardous to your health. And you don't want to take the risk that any mold will have the spores that are a part of the mold's life cycle. So making sure that you don't put in too much food, or that the food that you put in doesn't have mold on it already, or that you make sure that you control how much moisture is there, because molds have to have air and water, and if they dry out, then they're not able to produce the spores. Rodents, I already mentioned. Slugs, you probably don't want slugs in your house. So if that's where you're doing your worm composting, you can use some of the structures that I showed you just a couple slides ago. The structures that have legs, you can put bowls of water around the legs that act like kind of moats, and the slugs can't get in there. We curse slugs and clay at about the same rate, but actually they're valuable in the environment because they're doing that same kind of decomposition. It's just that we find them kind of icky and we don't like them. Be sure that the food, the bedding, and the worms don't dry out, and that's typically a temperature issue, but it may just be that you've neglected to put water in with your kitchen scraps. Then on the other hand, don't let them run out of food or put in so much that you find molding happening before the compost actually occurs. And actually molds are doing decomposition themselves. They're part of the composting process. It's just the danger of having spores that you might be allergic to, or that will cause lung problems, that you have to look out for. Now, there is some research to indicate that if you don't harvest the castings of the worms regularly enough, That actually becomes toxic to the worms. I have not been able to find a definitive resource that says how much they can tolerate, but after a time, because their castings have already been decomposed, there's no food available to them. And they may not have any of the microbes living on the castings, which are small enough that the worms can actually digest. So you need to separate the worms from their castings at least every other month. I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. And don't worry about springtails. And they're just a shade above microscopic, but you can see them because you're going to see the air movement, and you'll see them zip right through the air. But don't worry about them. They're not going to hurt you. Next slide, please. So what does this whole process produce? On the left, and these are all products out of that my worms have created. On the left, you'll see a photograph of worm castings, worm poop, and in the jar is worm tea. Worm castings contain micronutrients, including iron, sulfur, magnesium, zinc, copper, and calcium. I will represent to you that those are all necessary for healthy plant growth. But they also contain the nutrients that plants need a lot of, including nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And those are NPK are the three numbers that you see if you buy commercial fertilizer. The first one is nitrogen. The second is, so if you see 10, 5, 18, the 10 is nitrogen, the 5 is potassium, and the 18 or whatever it is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. They're alphabetical. And what that tells you is by weight in that fertilizer mix, by weight, not percentage, by weight, how much each of those makes up of the total 100%. So if you have 10, 10, 10, so equal amounts, percentages of each, of the entire 100% by weight, only 10% is each of those three. And the micronutrients, plants have a wide variety of needs. Both species have different needs, and across the board, plants don't need many of these micronutrients, but they're available in most clay. The worm tea that drains to the container bottom can be used as a liquid fertilizer. It's primarily nitrogen. And when worms or red wrigglers excrete poop, their castings actually have a coating around it that makes the nutrients, it keeps them from immediately dissolving in whatever, unless you put it in water, then it dissolves. But if you use the castings themselves, it takes longer for the nutrients to become available to the plants in your garden soil. And so it kind of makes it time release. But you add water, and then the nutrients get into the soil and are absorbed by the roots of the plants. And the castings themselves, over time, break down even further and are water soluble because there's some amount of fiber that didn't get reduced back to its molecules by the bacteria. That takes other microbes that are in the soil, and sometimes the plants themselves are able to convert that. Now, on the right, you see white things. Well, this was a mistake. You'll see that one of the micronutrients that plants need that worm castings have is calcium. Calcium is especially important for tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers. And some of you may have experienced blossom end rot, which means that those three members, they're all members of the same family. Those three vegetables, they're actually fruits because they have seeds. They didn't get enough calcium, largely because of watering issues and sometimes because of soil pH, the acidity. But they do need calcium, and eggshells are a wonderful source of calcium. The problem is that because these didn't get ground up or pulverized or put in a blender, however you can reduce the size, they just end up sitting there. And they're probably going to look like this, exactly like this, in 5 or 10 years. So if you have substances like eggshells that can prove valuable to providing those nutrients to your plants through the work of your worm castings, you're going to need to get them in a small enough shape and size before you put them in the worm bin so that they'll break down and be available to the plants. It may take a little longer because calcium is a little harder a mineral than some of the rest of these, and it's not water soluble. So think about how long it's going to take for whatever you put in, whether it's newspaper or junk mail or eggshells, so that these nutrients are going to be available to your plants, which is the ultimate beneficiary of taking a little more time to put them in the worm bin. Next slide, please. Now, I told you I was going to show you how you separate the worms from the castings because you want to retain the worms. There's no reason to have to go purchase or somehow obtain more. And what we're doing is using some of the important factors that I talked about what worms are and what their environmental conditions have to be. So what you see on the left is just a piece of black plastic. I turn over my worm bin tray. I then, as you can see on the right, make little mounds of these combinations. You'll find that the red wrigglers, as well as their eggs, as well as some as yet decomposed organic material. You can probably see some eggshells in there in the mix, and put them in little piles. It helps if you can put it in an environment where you can have a strong light above them, like a kitchen counter or a dining room table. I urge you not to do this outside in 70, 80, 90 degree weather because you want the worms to stay cool and moist. So as you make little mounds of these, much like what happened in the snakes on a plane, the worms dive as best they can. They use their muscles to go to the bottom of the pile because the light hurts their skin. And then you just pull off the castings from the top of the pile. It usually takes half an hour or something like that for them to move down to the bottom. And then you'll see in there, sometimes you can pick out the baby worms or the eggs, put them aside with the adults, and then rebuild your worm bin again. But you've got the castings separate. You will have been collecting the worm tea over the process many of weeks or up to 2 months. And the worm tea can be used anytime. It helps, again, if you keep these castings in some kind of a container that you can retain the moisture, but not enough moisture that you're dissolving the castings so that it becomes less able to manage in your garden. Next, please. Now, I'm not going to read this. Since this is going to be available on YouTube, you can yourself go to the URL down at the bottom from the University of California. But you've got this wonderful worm castings. What do you do with it? And in what places can you use it? And how much should you use? And this is a really good compilation of all of the many ways that worm castings and the worm tea can be used. And so perhaps you can go back to this and refer to it so that you're not overdoing it, because the last thing I assume you want to do is to burn the roots of any of the plants, whether it's in native soil or houseplants, but they're very well used. I will share with you that the one mistake that I made using worm castings is when I first began, I took probably about 4 cups and put it into my vegetable garden, and there was so much nitrogen in it that I ended up getting mostly leaves and not many fruits, because nitrogen is the major nutrient necessary for photosynthesis to grow those green leaves that eventually produce enough food for the plant to develop the fruits and the seeds and the flowers, not in that order, that we're having gardens for in the first place. Next, please. Again, here are some other sources that you might want to consult. Um, Improving garden soils with organic matter. Sorry, that's partially covered up. Um, this is specifically, well, this is an Oregon State University publication. It's specifically helpful for clay because it was developed to show how we can use organic material to lighten up clay and make it more easily valuable for our ornamental plants and our vegetable gardens by, if you remember back, just creating airways and ways for the water to get down to the roots of the plant. And be sure not to walk on soil that you're doing this to, because you're compacting it then just by your weight or driving over it, and you've kind of lost all the benefits of adding that organic material. But the second reference there, the URL, will take you to the study that I referred to about how sometimes too much organic material has been added to soil. Again, native soil, not potting soil. But this also has links to some really valuable soil testing places, analytical labs that will do soil testing, both for your soil pH, soil acidity, and to see how much nutrient each of these macro and micronutrients, and they will give you recommendations about how much to add to your soil for specific crops that are there, both in terms of changing the pH and correcting nutritional deficiencies. And there is also a link to an Oregon State article about how to read the test data that you get back from the lab so that you're making use of the information that you just paid them to provide to you. Next slide, please. And then finally, here are some additional resources about worm composting. The one on the left, Worm Bin Basics, is produced by Metro. I believe it is still available online. Metro is not doing paper publication of a lot of these resources that we've relied on for a couple of decades. But if you can get that information online, you're getting the same thing without cutting down a tree and sending it to you. And the book on the right was probably the best known of the worm bin phase, the creation of it. The woman who wrote this died just within the last 10 years or so, but it had multiple editions, and worms do eat our garbage. And in a sense, because they help us produce more plants, they create more garbage. I think you'll find it entertaining, but it is, even in as many years as it's been since it first came out, kind of the Bible for those of you who are new to the concept and want to do it right the first place. I want to mention one other thing, and that is I've had some people who have asked how to find red wrigglers. You can contact Metro, and Metro has a list of worm dealers who can provide red wrigglers. But if you have in your own backyard or a friend or neighbor's backyard one of those black composting bins, because red wrigglers live only in environments where there is organic material to be broken down, they don't go into the soil, you'll often find that they're attracted to the area just above the soil environment, but below whatever organic material has been put into one of these composting systems. And so all you have to do is to get down into the very bottom part of that composting material, and you may find a source of worms. And if they're in a happy environment, they will continue propagating and growing in the years span that I referenced earlier. And so you probably won't have to spend a dime. I also have been able to find resources on Craigslist, and occasionally on one of the free cycle websites that someone will have some to offer to you. But you need to protect them much like you would pets because they are valuable. They're providing excellent resources for your plants. And I'll share with you that I keep one of those worm bin systems. I used to keep it in the guest bathroom in the shower stall. And when people would ask if they could use the restroom, I'd send them in there. And when they came back, I'd ask them if they had a nice conversation with my pets, and they didn't know what I was talking about. Well, the nice thing about worms is not only do you not have to pay them a salary or sign them up for Social Security or withholding, but they're very quiet. And there are some systems that you can buy that actually look like side tables. So you can use them in your living room and have your worms munching away, but you can't hear them, and pooping and you can't smell them. And it'll provide something interesting for you to talk about at your next dinner party. I hope you have learned a few things about worms and composting here, and hopefully you'll acquire some and get a free source of nutrients for your soon-to-be healthy garden. Thank you for watching.
Well, thank you, Kris, for all of that great information. I was taking notes, and the photograph of the eggshells, I got to admit, that happened to me too. It's and I guess the lesson there is that whatever you're going to add, it doesn't hurt to put it in a blender or put it in something to break that down, whether it's paper or eggshells or whatever.
Yeah, the smaller the better.
The smaller the better. The other thing I noted too, and again, this is something that I'd not really thought about, was when you were talking about feces of other animals, right? We sort of think, well, there's raccoon poop or there's cat poop or dog poop. That's great. We'll just blend it in and make that part of the environment. But that delicate balance is something that I think it kind of often we forget that, right?
Let me differentiate that kind of fecal material from fecal material that you can buy, but if you have a farm, obviously, or whether it's 1 cow or 15 chickens, you can get both steer manure and chicken manure. The problem, and just think about the anatomy. Chickens, when they eliminate solid material and urine in the same plot. Okay, so that's going to be high in nitrogen, urea, and that high nitrogen amount may burn the roots of the plants. So we talk about chicken manure being aged at least 6 months so that the nitrogen can dissipate. Steer manure, on the other hand, they urinate out of one organ and they defecate out of a different one, and they may not be anywhere close to each other. So steer manure has to be aged a little less than that, but both of these are animals that eat only plants. So they're not acquiring the same kind of roundworm pests, if you will, that the raccoons, etc., are out there, because raccoon will eat just about anything. So they can eat spoiled food that may have parasites, etc., in it, and then it just gets passed on to you through your food.
I want to just mention that we will provide links to these resources in the description section of the YouTube video. So all of those URLs will be there.
Great.
You're welcome to watch through again to find them, but they'll be in the description field as well. And then we'll also provide links to some of the other sources from Metro, and maybe even a link to the book that you mentioned at the very end. And again, if you have questions or comments, please go ahead and post those now, and we can get to those. we have a couple minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get everybody's
Okay.
input and make this interactive. So please feel free to post those now. Um, One of the things I'm wondering about is, in terms of the bedding, um, is there a kind of an ideal balance between bedding that's too wet or too dry? I mean, how do you kind of, is that an issue, and how do you kind of make that determination?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's why the drainage issue within the structure itself is so important. I've had, uh, I use the tiered ones, the black tiered ones. It fits into my bathtub or my shower stall, and it's easy to drain off the worm tea. But depending upon the structure, the black tall one with tiers has plastic that has spaces in between, and you have to put something in there to keep the worms from falling through into the next lower tier. So before I start putting it together, I shred, not very much, but I shred some newspaper. I soak it in water, and then I keep enough of a space around the outside that there's airflow between those tiers. And then I add the worms, and some people keep the food away from the bedding, quote unquote, but it's really keeping it moist and to some extent, as I said, keeping the worms from falling through to the next level. That's the idea. You just always want to make sure that they're covered, whether it's with kitchen scraps or more shredded newspaper or the shredded junk mail that you bring in. You're not shredding it with them because they're going to be eating it, because it's still going to be too big for them to eat. But because everything, including all of our skins, are covered with bacteria, eventually the microbes are going to grow on that. So there are two reasons to have newspaper in there. And then, as I said, you don't have to worry about over watering as long as it's moist and it's keeping them cool if you have the right drainage issue. It's much like container gardening. You never want to grow any plant in a container that doesn't drain, because we're the fungus capital of the world, and we have every kind of fungus, soil, and airborne imaginable, and they survive in moist, dark environments. So whether it's a house plant or a container that you have outside, you want to make sure it drains. And the same thing applies when you're trying to compost using the worm's digestive process. You need to make sure that neither they nor their bedding nor their food is sitting in standing water.
And is there a good way to test that? I mean, I mean,
No.
if you pick up a clump of it, can you tell, or is it?
Well, you can wring it out. If it's too dry that you can't even crumple it, it's too dry. If you pick it up and it's sopping wet, would you want to sleep on it or put it around you to keep you cool? We have, humans' temperature comfort range isn't all that different from worms. We don't come with built-in parkas or cooling systems other than sweating, right? And so in that respect, we're a lot like our fellow animal worms. So if you would find that and you're not going to have this sopping problem, even with newspaper, if it has air and water drainage, air circulation and water drainage. I've never had any worms drowning except for the ones that fell through the cracks, literally, and ended up, and even they will try to get up the sides, the sloping sides. They're very persistent. You got to give them credit for not having any reportable income. They do a great job working for us.
Well, it sounds like there might be some trial and error and maybe some process improvement involved in putting something together, right? That
Yeah.
the first couple may not may not work. So
That's
keep
true.
going,
That's true.
keep
But
going.
that's
Yeah.
why I suggest that I can just kind of scratch the surface of the topic, but this Metro publication and then Worms Eat My Garbage gives you a few more details about doing it. But
Mm,
it's pretty hard to screw it up just
okay.
between us.
Good. Good.
And they won't report you to OSHA or anything
Yeah.
like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. There's no. There's.
No,
There's.
no,
There's no.
no.
No filing of
No
grievances or
penalties.
anything.
No, no,
Yeah.
no, no,
Yeah.
no. No, they're
So we
quiet that way.
we have a question from Kevin. He says, "Should I buy or make a worm farm?"
Well, are you talking about a worm farm in terms of the worm composting system that I've been describing? Or are you talking about a worm farm so that you can sell worms to other potential composters?
Mm,
That sounds like more work than I would wish to take on. But then again, I have a pretty large landscape and a lot of plants that need my care.
mhm,
Um, I think I would suggest that the contact, if you want to do it commercially, someone like the man who sells these Earth 360. I think it's Uncle Bob's or something like that. He's on the East Coast. He actually also sells worms. So if you talk to
Uncle Jim.
somebody, Uncle
Uncle
Jim,
Jim.
that's it. That's
Yeah.
it. Uncle Jim. That's right. Thank you. Um, but there will, I assure you, always be an audience and a market for people who want to add worms. It is a very, very growing activity to do in terms of home gardening. And I
Mm,
think people are realizing that you don't need to go pay a chemical company to buy fill in the blank container of fertilizer. And I live in the country and we don't have our yard scraps or even kitchen things picked up. But I wouldn't pay them anything to haul it away someplace else. And then I buy compost back.
mhm.
It's here. So
Right.
that's how I feel about garden fertilization, as well as the process of utilizing worms eating activities to provide that for me for free.
Yeah. So Kevin clarified. So should I buy or make a worm farm for composting? So I guess.
Oh, okay. I think those uh, plastic containers that nest into each other. So I think that's probably certainly under $30 is just as easily done, and it's probably easier to maintain in terms of rotating. If you decide you want to clean one out, for example, you can always find a third one to nest in there. They're very, very simple. And I strongly urge you to look at that Metro publication that has some various styles about how you can, A, make them easy to carry around because they're very light until you start putting limbs in there, and you're not going to do that anyway. But making sure that you're getting the airflow and the drainage that you need. Those are the two major components of this. I'll tell you, I taught the Master Gardener program at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility 6 times in 2 years, and they had the most wonderful worm composting system. So if they can do it, the inmates there can do it under the restrictions that exist in a penal facility. I assure you that you that have a lot more freedom out here can find all the components that you need and do it successfully for your worms.
So the message is go forth and compost.
Or let it rot.
Let it rot. I like that one too. I like that. Well, Kris, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to
You're welcome.
provide some additional um, sources of information about how to take advantage of these amazing creatures that are in our soil and to put them to work for us. As you said, without paying for them and without withholding anything from them. Uh, and I hope that everybody gets an opportunity to put some of these techniques to use in their own garden.
Thank you.
Again, let folks know that these programs are archived on our YouTube channel. And as I said, we'll pop the links to all of those sources in the description field once this goes up. So Kris, again, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And everybody
And Bob,
else have
one other
yes.
thing, just a footnote.
Yes.
I told you about the Metro resource, and you can call Metro and they have recycling experts there who will hook you up if they don't know the answer. But the other thing is, you're always welcome to go to any Oregon State Extension Office website. Down at the bottom, there's an Ask an Expert. You can always pose questions there. You can also call any of the extension offices or email them, and we'll have master gardeners who will try to help answer some of the questions that our audiences posed and some of even your questions as well. So we're always there as resources.
Great. Okay. Well, that's another one we'll add to the video. Okay. Again, yeah. Kris, thank you so much. And everybody else, have a great weekend and get out in the garden. All right, we'll see you all later.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.